Sit down, Captain. That's a direct order. Hargrove's voice cracked through the room like a gunshot. He stepped forward, chest out, finger pointed directly at Nora Hayes' 5'4" flight suit, still dusty, standing alone in the back row, while 30 men stared at the floor. Nobody else had stood up. Nobody else was going to. Hargrove leaned in close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and said it again slower this time, like she was something he needed to put back in its place. Sit down. Nora looked him dead in the eye. She did not sit down. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel, follow along to the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The briefing shack smelled like burnt coffee and old fear. That particular combination, stale caffeine and the kind of sweat that only comes from people who have stopped pretending they are not scared, was something Captain Mason Reed had grown to recognize over 11 years of special operations. It was the smell of a room full of professionals who already knew the math and didn't like the answer. 30 people sat in that plywood box at the edge of nowhere. Pilots, operators, a combat controller who hadn't slept in 36 hours. 2 Navy SEALs whose uniforms were still crusted with sand from a previous op that never quite got debriefed because another one started immediately after. A flight surgeon who sat in the corner with his arms crossed, already calculating blood pressure and fluid requirements in his head before anyone had even said the words out loud. Mason Reed stood at the front of the room with a laminated map taped to a plywood board and a red lens flashlight in his hand, and he looked like a man who had already been to 3 funerals today and was preparing himself for a 4th. He didn't waste time. 6 men down in Canyon Sierra 9, he said. Recon element. They went in at 1400 for a 20-minute observation run. Storm hit faster than forecast. Wind shear collapsed their extraction window before the birds could get out. They've been pinned for 4 hours. 2 are critical. 1 is not going to make it past another 2 hours without a surgeon's hands on him. He paused, not for effect, because sometimes you just need a second to keep going. Medevac is grounded base-wide. The storm is sitting directly on every primary and secondary route. The standard extraction corridors are covered by confirmed enemy activity on the ridge lines. We have one possible approach, Canyon Sierra 9 itself. Low, fast, under the storm ceiling, hugging the floor. He clicked the red light off. It is a one-way approach in a heavy-lift aircraft. The canyon is too narrow, enemy positioning too elevated. A heavy bird goes in, it doesn't come out. That's not speculation. That's geometry. Nobody moved. Someone coughed. A young staff sergeant in the second row stared at his boots. The combat controller, a man named Owens, who had done 3 combat deployments and never once flinched at a targeting brief, was now very carefully studying a water stain on the plywood wall to his left. Reed let the silence sit for exactly long enough. Then he said it. Any combat pilots here? The question was technically unnecessary. He knew who was in the room. He had the roster. He had cross-referenced every qualification, every airframe, every flight hour, logged in every aircraft type that had ever touched that canyon. Captain Mason Reed did not ask questions he didn't already know the answers to. But he asked it anyway because there are some things a commanding officer cannot order. Some things have to be chosen. And the choosing that public witnessed undeniable act of a person stepping towards something that might kill them that matters. It matters in a way that a direct order never quite can, because a direct order gives you something to blame. A choice gives you nothing but yourself. Any combat pilots here? The question landed and stayed there, suspended in the recycled air of the briefing shack, like smoke that wouldn't clear. 7 seconds. 8. 9. In the 4th row, a captain named Darren Holt, one of the most experienced rotary wing pilots at the base, a man with over 2,000 flight hours and 3 distinguished flying crosses, very slowly raised his coffee cup to his lips and took a long, deliberate sip. He did not stand up. In the 2nd row, a warrant officer named Vasquez, who had flown combat approaches in 2 different theaters and who had a reputation for being the coolest head in any cockpit, found something deeply fascinating about the zipper of his flight jacket. He studied it carefully. He did not stand up. A pilot named Cho, 3 rows back, had his eyes closed. Whether he was praying or sleeping or simply refusing to acknowledge the room's existence was unclear. He did not stand up. 15 seconds. 20. Reed's jaw was tight, not angry, just holding something back, some combination of frustration and understanding that existed only in people who had spent years asking human beings to do things that human beings were not designed to do. "I need a combat pilot," he said again, and this time his voice was quieter, which somehow made it worse. "I need someone who has flown Sierra 9. I need someone light, fast, someone flying something that can hug the canyon floor without becoming a target silhouette. I need it now." 25 seconds of silence. And then from the back row, the sound of boots on plywood. Nora Hayes had not intended to stand up. That was the truth of it, and she would tell it that way later. In the moments when she was honest with herself, she had not walked into that briefing shack with any intention of volunteering for anything. She was tired. She was deeply, profoundly bone-ache tired in the way that builds up after 6 consecutive days of light attack, support operations. Not the dramatic Hollywood kind of exhaustion where your hands shake and your vision blurs, but the quieter, more dangerous kind, where you stop feeling the fatigue at all and simply begin operating on something below conscious thought. She had been assigned to that briefing as a courtesy notification. Standard protocol. Make sure the light attack element understands the operational picture in case support is needed along the periphery. She wasn't supposed to be a solution. She was supposed to be a footnote. She flew MH-6 Little Birds. Fast light stripped down helicopters built for speed and precision insertion, not extraction, not medical evacuation, not canyon rescues in zero visibility sandstorms with enemy personnel on elevated positions. The Little Bird was a precision instrument designed for very specific operations, and what Reed was describing was not one of them. She knew all of this. She also knew Canyon Sierra 9. 3 weeks earlier, on a low-altitude reconnaissance run that had been half-authorized and mostly improvised, Nora had taken her MH-6 through Sierra 9 at dusk following a suspected equipment cache route. She had gone alone below the ridgelines with her transponder off and her lights dark because that was sometimes what the job required and sometimes what her instincts demanded. She had memorized that canyon the way pilots memorize anything that might kill them, with absolute obsessive attention filing every turn and wind pocket and rock formation into some part of her brain that operated separately from fear. She had not told anyone about that flight. Now she stood in the back of the briefing shack, and the words came out before she fully decided to say them. "I know that canyon." The room turned. Not all at once, more like a slow, rolling tide of attention moving from front to back as people registered the sound of a voice coming from a direction nobody had expected. Reed's eyes found her immediately. She was not what the room expected. 5'4" in a flight suit that had a grease stain on the left forearm from a pre-flight she'd done 3 hours ago. Her hair was pulled back tight. Her face was the particular shade of pale that comes from too little sun and too much cockpit time, and she had the look of someone who had just said something out loud that she hadn't quite finished deciding whether to say. "Captain Hayes," Reed said slowly. Not a question. Confirmation. "Little Bird element," she said, "light attack." "I know who you are." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know Sierra 9? I've flown it." The room was completely silent, and then from somewhere in the middle rows a voice said it. The voice belonged to Warrant Officer Vasquez, who had been studying his jacket zipper so intently a moment ago. He didn't say it loudly, just clearly enough for the room to hear. "She's going to get herself killed." Nora didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Reed. Reed said, "Walk me through what you know." She moved to the front of the room. She stood next to his map and she pointed, and as she spoke, her voice was flat and precise and stripped of everything except information, because information was the only thing that mattered right now. "The canyon entrance is here," she said, touching the laminate. 40-foot clearance on the eastern approach. If you hug left, hard left, within about 8 feet of the rock face, you avoid the wind shear pocket that sits in the center of the entrance corridor. It's a downdraft, violent. Anything wider than my aircraft in that pocket gets slammed into the floor. Reed leaned forward. "You've flown that approach." "At dusk, zero moon, lower visibility than tonight, but similar wind conditions." "That was a reconnaissance pass," said a voice from the room. Darren Holt finally putting down his coffee cup. "One direction light aircraft, no payload. What you're talking about is an extraction, fully loaded, going in and coming back out." Nora looked at him. "Yes." "With 6 bodies." "Yes." "On a Little Bird that's rated for 4. She was quiet for exactly 1 second. Yes. Holt spread his hands. Then I'm not sure what exactly she's volunteering for, Captain Reed, because what she's describing is a crash with extra steps. Reed turned back to Nora. He's not wrong. He's not wrong about the math, she said. He's wrong about the pilot. The room made a sound. Not words, just a collective exhale, the sound of 30 professionals recalibrating their opinion of something they had just written off. Reed stared at her for a long moment. His jaw worked. He glanced at the map. He glanced at the clock on the wall, a digital display showing time in 3 zones, the most important of which was the one labeled local, currently reading 2247. How long to prep your aircraft? 12 minutes. For full strip down at 10. Reed looked at the flight surgeon. The flight surgeon looked at his hands. Then he looked up and said quietly, if they're where we think they are, and one of them is critical, we have maybe 90 minutes. Probably less. Reed looked back at Nora. Take the weapons off, he said. Everything that isn't bolted down. I want you light as you can get. Already planning on it. You'll fly dark. No lights, no transponder past the canyon entrance. Enemy positions are suspected on the east ridge line above the extraction point. You go in, you come out, you do not stop for anything except the beacon. Understood. You'll need a crew chief. Nora paused. This was the part she hadn't thought through yet, or rather the part she had already thought through and was hoping he wouldn't bring up, because a crew chief meant another person in the aircraft, another person in the canyon, another person she would be responsible for bringing home. The extraction was going to be ugly. The return flight was going to be worse. 2 pilots in that situation was a conversation she had already had with herself, and she had already lost. I'll go solo, she said. You can't manage a 6-man extraction solo. You need someone on the skids. I can rig the extraction harnesses pre-flight, skid loaded. I land, they load themselves, I lift. Minimal contact. In 0 visibility. I'll set the IR beacon frequency. They find me, I don't have to find them. Reed breathed in through his nose. He looked at her the way commanding officers look at someone who is either brilliant or suicidal, and in the field that distinction is frequently irrelevant. You know, if you go in solo and something goes wrong, then something goes wrong, Nora said, and nobody else goes down with me. The room was silent again. Different silence this time. Not the heavy paralyzed silence of before, the silence of people pretending they hadn't heard a question. This was something else. This was the silence of people who had just watched something happen that they hadn't quite expected, something that changed the weight distribution of the room in a way they couldn't immediately describe. Vasquez, in the middle row, had stopped looking at his jacket zipper. He was looking at Nora. Holt had picked up his coffee cup again, but he wasn't drinking from it. He was just holding it very still, staring at the map. Reed, said Sergeant Owens. The combat controller in the front row looked up. Get Captain Hayes everything she needs for a coal strip down. 15 minutes, fuel check IR package skid rigging. He looked at Nora. You have the authorization, go. Nora nodded, she turned to leave. And then Reed said quietly, so quietly that half the room probably didn't hear it, Hayes. She stopped. They're good men. She didn't turn around. I know, she said, and she walked out into the storm. The desert at night during a sandstorm is not a place that accommodates human beings gracefully. The sand moves horizontally. It finds every seal, every gap, every small opening in your gear and your face and your aircraft, and it deposits itself there with patient, indifferent precision. The way nature always deposits itself without malice, without mercy, without any awareness at all that you exist. Nora moved across the flight line with her head down and her hands jammed into her flight suit pockets, because there was nothing to be done about the wind except to move through it, and moving through it was its own kind of answer. She found her aircraft in its revetment, the MH-6M tail. Number 674, the one she had been flying for the last 3 months, the one she knew by feel and sound, and the particular way it vibrated at 120 knots in turbulence. It was a small aircraft. People who saw little birds for the first time frequently made some version of the same joke. That's not a helicopter, that's a motorcycle with a rotor. And they weren't entirely wrong. The MH-6 was built lean, a skeletal fuselage, 2 bench seats on external platforms, a bubble canopy, and the bare minimum of everything that wasn't required for flight. Tonight it needed to be even less than that. Sergeant Owens appeared out of the sand 3 minutes later with two junior enlisted soldiers and a toolbox, and they went to work in silence the way professionals go to work when there is no time for anything except the work. The weapons went first: the M134 minigun pod, the Hellfire pylons, the 2.75-inch rocket pods. 600 pounds of ordnance removed with practiced efficiency while the wind tried to rip the equipment out of their hands. Then the external communications antenna array, non-essential in the canyon. Then the co-pilot's instrument panel. There was no co-pilot, and the weight mattered more than the redundancy. Then the cargo restraint system, the backup navigation displays, 3 of the 4 emergency ration kits, the non-essential medical kit. Nora stood in the cockpit during the strip down, running a pre-flight with her hands, while her eyes went over numbers she had already memorized. Fuel full, which was both a necessity and a problem, because full fuel meant weight, and weight was the enemy tonight, but running out of fuel over that canyon was a different kind of enemy entirely. She calculated. She decided. She left the fuel alone. Owens appeared at her elbow. Skid rigging is set, 6-point system port and starboard. They'll be hanging on the outside in full exposure. They'll survive the exposure, Nora said. Survival is the objective. Ma'am, he paused. Wind is reading gusts to 63 knots at the canyon entrance. She looked at him. Per the last reading, he added carefully. When was the last reading? At 22 minutes ago. Then I'll get a new one when I get there, she said. He nodded slowly. He understood what she was saying, that the wind reading at the canyon entrance 22 minutes ago was irrelevant to the wind reading she would find when she arrived, and that there was no information available in this revetment, in this base, in this desert, that would tell her what that canyon was going to do tonight. There was only going there. Aircraft is ready, he said. Thank you, Sergeant. He started to turn away, then stopped. He was young, 25, 26. He had the face of someone who had aged faster than his years, but not quite fast enough. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him trying to decide whether to say something. He decided. My brother was in that recon element, he said. He's one of the 2 critical. Nora looked at him for a long moment. She didn't say anything reassuring. She didn't make promises. She had been in this job long enough to know that promises made on a flight line in a sandstorm were a particular kind of cruelty dressed up as comfort. She said, get clear of my rotors. He stepped back. She climbed into the cockpit. The engine start sequence took 47 seconds. She knew because she had counted it 100 times, not out of anxiety, but out of precision. Every second of engine start was a second of rotor acceleration, a second closer to flight, and tonight she did not have seconds to waste. The rotor came up. The vibration moved through the airframe and into her hands and up her arms and settled somewhere in her chest the way it always did, not uncomfortable, just present. The particular frequency of a Little Bird engine at idle was something she had internalized years ago before she was even aware she was doing it, the way you internalize the sound of someone's breathing in a dark room until you can tell the difference between sleep and wakefulness by sound alone. She keyed the radio. Sierra Base, this is Tango 674, pre-flight complete, ready for departure on your mark. A pause, then Reed's voice. Tango 674 Sierra Base, you are cleared for departure. Wind at departure heading is 040 at 48, gusting 59. Ceiling is non-existent. FLIR is active. Good luck. He said it without ceremony, the way you say a thing, when ceremony would be an insult to the reality of what you're asking. Nora's hand moved to the collective. And then before she lifted in the half-second between the decision and the action, she allowed herself exactly one thought that was not tactical. She thought about the 6 men in that canyon. She didn't know their names. She didn't know their faces. She knew one of them had a brother standing 30 feet behind her right now with sand in his eyes and his heart in his throat. She knew one of them wasn't going to survive another 2 hours without intervention. She knew she was the intervention. That was enough. She pulled up on the collective. The Little Bird left the ground, and the desert swallowed it whole, and the storm closed behind her like a door. The storm hit her the moment she cleared the perimeter lights. Not gradually, not with any warning. 1 second she had 30 feet of visibility and a horizon she could roughly estimate, and the next second the desert swallowed her whole, and there was nothing outside the canopy, except brown-black darkness moving at 60 miles an hour in every direction simultaneously. Nora's hands tightened on the cyclic. Not gripping, squeezing. There is a difference, and every pilot learns it the hard way, because gripping is fear, and squeezing is control, and tonight she needed every fraction of control she could extract from her own nervous system. Tango 674 Sierra Base. You are 2 miles from canyon entrance. Wind update 045 at 61 gusting 67. Ceiling is sitting directly on your altitude. Recommend immediate abort if visibility falls below approach minimums. Reed's voice, professional, neutral. And underneath the neutrality, something she recognized, not quite worry, but the controlled version of it. The kind of thing a commanding officer allows himself when he has sent someone into something he cannot follow. Sierra Base 674 copies, she said. Continuing approach. A pause, then copy that. Good luck, Hayes. She didn't respond to that one. She was already calculating. At 61 knots, sustained the wind shear at the canyon entrance was going to be worse than anything she had experienced on her reconnaissance pass 3 weeks ago. That flight had been challenging, unpredictable. There had been a moment threading the eastern approach at low altitude, where the aircraft had dropped 14 feet in under a second and her stomach had disconnected from her body entirely, while her hands made the corrections before her brain finished registering that something was wrong. Tonight, it was going to be worse than that. She kept her altitude at 40 feet above ground level, which was low enough to stay below the worst of the storm ceiling and high enough to avoid the terrain variations she couldn't see. She was flying on instruments and instinct in equal measure, which is a combination that either works perfectly or kills you without ceremony. The FLR forward-looking infrared was her primary navigation tool, now painting a green-tinged picture of the terrain ahead on the small screen to her right. It was not a comfortable picture. The desert floor was not flat, it was not cooperative. It rose and fell and jutted and dropped in ways that the daylight maps had never fully captured, and the FLIR rendered all of it in the same flat green, making the drop-off she was approaching look identical to the gentle slope that preceded it. She had to trust what she knew, rather than what she could see. And what she knew was 40 feet hard left canyon entrance in approximately 90 seconds. The radio crackled. 674 Sierra Base. We have a new development. It was not Reed's voice this time. It was Owens, the combat controller, the one whose brother was bleeding on a canyon floor 2 miles away. His voice was tight, professionally tight, the way people sound when they are holding something enormous behind a very thin wall. Enemy activity update from ISR. We're seeing movement on the east ridgeline above Sierra 9. Minimum 3 personnel, possibly more. They may have thermal imaging capability. Nora processed this in the time it takes to breathe. Thermal imaging meant they could see her heat signature even through the storm, which meant flying dark was not the protection she had planned on, which meant the approach she had mapped in her head, hug the left wall, stay low, minimize exposure time, needed to happen faster and lower than she had calculated. Copy, she said. Does Reed know? Affirmative. He's on secondary channel. Tell him I'm not turning around. A beat of silence. Then Owens said, and she could hear what it cost him. Already told him you wouldn't. She almost smiled. Almost. Then the canyon entrance appeared on the FLEOIR, a dark gap between 2 thermal masses, the rock walls radiating slightly more heat than the surrounding terrain, and for just a moment, looking at it on that small green screen, Nora felt the thing she never let herself feel before a difficult approach. She felt how small the aircraft was. She pushed the feeling down the way you push anything down that will get you killed if you hold onto it, and she dropped altitude to 20 feet and turned hard left and went in. The canyon swallowed her exactly the way she remembered it. The wind shear hit her at the entrance like a physical object, not a gust of wall. The aircraft dropped 8 feet in less than a second, and her left skid was suddenly close enough to the canyon floor that she could hear the rotor wash bouncing back off the stone, a particular hollow roar that meant she was operating inside tolerances she had promised herself she would not operate inside. Her right hand made 4 corrections in 2 seconds. She didn't think about them. They happened the way breathing happens below the level of conscious instruction in some part of the nervous system that had been trained over thousands of hours to respond before the brain could intervene and slow everything down with fear. The aircraft stabilized, 14 feet above the canyon floor, left skid 4 feet from the wall. Forward speed 32 knots, which was slower than she wanted, but faster than the terrain was forgiving of. She exhaled. Sierra Base 674. I'm inside, she said. A long pause. Then read copy. Keep your head down. The canyon was darker than the storm outside, which seemed impossible, but was simply physics. The walls blocked whatever ambient light the storm allowed, and she was now navigating through a channel of stone that was approximately 40 feet wide at its narrowest and had enemy personnel above her and wounded men ahead of her and exactly no margin for error in any direction. She flew. And then the radio changed. Not the frequency, something in the quality of the transmission. A voice she hadn't heard yet. Rough, broken up by static and what sounded like winds significantly more violent than what she was experiencing inside the canyon. Male voice, low, the kind of low that comes from someone who is conserving every calorie of energy because they have very few left. Any station, any station. This is Sierra Actual Canyon Sierra 9 Grid Reference Kilo 79er. We have 2 urgent surgical, 1 priority. We are at the secondary extraction point 50 meters south of the infrared marker. We have been waiting, a pause, a sound that might have been coughing or might have been something worse, a long time. Nora keyed her radio immediately. Sierra Actual, this is Tango 674. I am inside the canyon approximately 1 mile from your position. I am inbound. Do you copy from static, a long terrible 3 seconds of static, then copy 674. We copy. A pause. Are you a little bird? Affirmative. Another pause, this one different. She couldn't see the man on the other end of that radio, but she could hear him doing the math. 6 wounded personnel, 1 MH6 rated for 4 canyon, extraction in 0 visibility, and arriving at the same place everyone else had arrived tonight. 674, the voice said slowly. How are you planning to? I'm going to land, Nora said. Load everyone on the skids. External carry. It's going to be uncomfortable, and I need everyone who can move to help the ones who can't. Can you do that? The longest pause yet, then very quietly, we'll make it work. She pushed forward on the cyclic. Half a mile out now, the canyon was narrowing. She could feel it in the rotor wash, the echoes coming back faster, tighter. The sound changing pitch the way it does when the walls close in and the air has less room to go. And then her FLIR showed her something that was not on any map. A boulder field. Not a small one. A collapsed some section of the canyon wall that had given way probably in the last storm cycle, depositing a 30-foot wide debris field directly across the path she had planned to fly. She had exactly 4 seconds to decide. Go over it at 15 feet of altitude, expose herself to the ridgeline above, give the thermal imaging team a clean acquisition window for 3 to 4 seconds at low speed. Go around it, the canyon didn't allow around. There was left wall and right wall and nothing else. Thread it, there was a gap, 6 feet wide, maybe 7. On the left side between the boulder face and the canyon wall, her aircraft was 6 feet wide at the skids with a rotor disc that extended considerably beyond that. 4 seconds, 3, 2, she went left. She put the left skid 4 inches from the canyon wall, and she dropped the nose and she pushed the aircraft through that gap at 28 knots, and the rotor disc cleared the boulder face by a margin she would later estimate at 18 inches and would never ever say out loud to anyone who asked. The gap was behind her. She was still flying. Her hands were shaking. Not badly. Just the fine, almost invisible tremor that comes after your body has spent a large amount of adrenaline in a very short time and is now presenting you with the invoice. She registered the shaking with the detached awareness of a pilot who has learned to monitor her own physical state the way she monitors her instruments as data, not as crisis. Data mild tremor in both hands. Acceptable. Does not affect stick control at current level. She kept flying. 674 Sierra Actual. We can hear your rotors. You are close. Copy. Beacon active. Beacon is active. IR strobe, 50 meters south of the primary marker. She was looking at the FLIR and she saw it, a pulsing hot point on the screen low to the ground, steady against the thermal chaos of the storm-blown canyon. The infrared strobe was small. If she hadn't known exactly what she was looking for, she might have missed it. She didn't miss it. Sierra Actual, I have your beacon. Stand by for landing. I need everyone capable of movement to be ready to assist loading on my skids. I am going to be on the ground for less than 90 seconds. Do you understand? Understood, 674. Tell me your layout. How many can walk? The voice on the radio, she still didn't know his name. This man, she was flying through a canyon of stone and enemy fire to reach, took a breath and said, 2 walking, 1 walking with assistance, 3 non-ambulatory. One of the 3 is, he stopped, started again. 1 is critical. We've been doing what we can. 6 men, 2 healthy enough to move on their own. 1 who needed help but could bear some weight. 3 who were going to have to be carried or dragged to the skids by people who were already beyond their physical limits. 90 seconds. She had 90 seconds on the ground. Copy, she said. I'm 30 seconds out. Get everyone moving toward the beacon now. She brought the aircraft down from 14 feet to 8 feet to 4 feet, and the rotor wash exploded off the canyon floor in all directions, and the dust and grit came up in a cloud that turned her flyer into a white-green blur, and she was now landing by feel and memory in a canyon she had flown once 3 weeks ago, in better conditions with no one's life, depending on whether she remembered exactly how the floor contoured in the last 15 feet. She remembered. The skids touched down hard, harder than she wanted, because the wind hit her from the left at exactly the wrong moment, and she compensated but not quite enough. And the right skid caught a rock, and the aircraft tilted 12 degrees to port, and for one terrible suspended moment, the rotor disc was angled toward the canyon wall, and she was calculating the distance in her head, and it was not a comfortable calculation. She applied right cyclic, hard, held it, felt the aircraft resist and then grudgingly angrily comply, rocking back toward level. The skids were down, the rotor was clear, she was on the ground. Sierra Actual, I'm down, move, now. And then she heard something that cut through the rotor noise, and the wind, and the static, and the pounding of her own heartbeat footsteps. Multiple sets, uneven, some dragging. The particular sound of people moving towards something with everything they have left, which is not the sound of running. It is slower than that and more desperate and more human. She heard a voice, one of the walking wounded, she thought from the sound of it, saying, come on this way, almost there. And then another voice, lower in pain, saying something she couldn't make out. And then a third voice, sharp and commanding, even through obvious injury, leave the gear, leave everything, get Martinez to the skid. Shapes appeared at the edge of her flare screen. 6 of them, moving toward her through the dust cloud like something out of a nightmare, hunched, supporting each other, one being carried between 2 others, their movements telling the story of 4 hours in a canyon under fire more clearly than any after-action report ever would. They reached the skids. Okay, she heard the commanding voice say, close now, right outside the aircraft. Wilson, get Martinez secured port side. Kowalski, help me get Chen. A burst of something hit the canyon wall above and to the right. Not a gunshot, something larger. A round from an elevated position, striking stone, sending chips and dust cascading down. The ridgeline. They had been found. 674, Reed's voice sharp on the radio. We have thermal acquisition on your position from the east ridgeline. You have enemy weapons hot. You need to go. Now. She did not need to be told twice. Is everyone on? She called out the canopy. 5 on. We're getting Chen secured 30 seconds. Another impact. Closer. The aircraft shook with the percussion. 20 seconds, Nora said. Her voice was flat. She was not angry. She was not afraid. She was simply measuring time against physics, and physics was currently winning. I'm lifting in 20 seconds with or without full load, secured. 10 more seconds. 15, she said, because 15 was what she had, and 20 was what she'd offered, and they were past both. He's on, go, go. She pulled collective. The engine screamed, the aircraft did not move. For one dreadful engine shriek and rotor howling second, the aircraft did not move, because it was carrying more weight than it had ever been designed to carry, more weight than the performance charts acknowledged was possible. More weight than the engineers who built it had accounted for in their most conservative worst-case calculations. Then it moved. 1 foot, 2. She was not flying. She was convincing the aircraft that it was flying through sheer mechanical insistence, feeding every ounce of engine power into the rotor system, and demanding that the laws of aerodynamics accommodate her current situation. The laws of aerodynamics were unimpressed, but they complied. 3 feet, 5. The canyon floor fell away beneath her. She was airborne. Barely. Technically, At a forward speed of 11 knots and an altitude of 6 feet and an engine torque, reading that was so far into the red that the warning light had given up trying to warn her and was simply glowing with what she could only describe as resigned concern. Another round hit the wall to her right. She felt the pressure wave. She turned the aircraft left and pushed forward and dropped the nose to trade altitude for speed, because speed was the only protection she had now, and she flew. The canyon was behind them. The men on the skids were not talking. She could hear them, their breathing, the sounds people make when they are holding on with the last of everything, and she flew. 1 mile. 2. The canyon walls fell away, and the open desert replaced them, and the storm hit her again from every direction. And she climbed carefully, deliberately, not so fast that the overloaded aircraft stalled, not so slow that the ridgeline had time to reacquire, and she turned toward the base frequency on her radio. Sierra Base Tango 674, Reed's voice came back immediately, like he had been holding the radio the entire time. Go ahead, Hayes. 6 souls aboard. Returning to base. 2 urgent surgical. A pause. We're going to need everyone on the flight line. Silence for exactly 2 seconds. Then quietly Reed said, Copy that. You did good, Hayes. She didn't answer. She was too busy flying. 12 miles out. 11! The aircraft groaned under its load and the storm pushed and pulled from every angle, and the men on her skids held on with frozen hands in the cold wind, and she flew through all of it, through the dark and the sun and the rotor noise and the pain of men she would never fully know, and she did not slow down, and she did not stop, and she did not think about anything except the next mile and the one after that. And the lights of the base that eventually appeared through the storm like something she had refused to stop believing in. The flight line came up fast. She brought the aircraft down hard, and the skids hit, and the rotor spun down, and she heard the medics. She could hear them running before the aircraft had fully stopped. Boots on tarmac, voices calling out triage instructions, the sound of a stretcher being deployed at speed. She sat in the cockpit. She did not move. Her hands were still on the controls, still making the micro adjustments that were no longer necessary because the aircraft was on the ground and the flight was over, and her nervous system had not yet received the message. Outside, she heard Owens. Not his voice, his specific intake of breath, the sound a person makes when they see their brother and the brother is alive. She closed her eyes just for a second. Then she opened them and began the shutdown sequence, and her hands were perfectly steady. She was still in the cockpit when Hargrove arrived. Not running, walking. The kind of deliberate, measured walk that senior officers use when they want to communicate that they are entirely in control of a situation that has just humiliated them in front of 30 subordinates. His boots were clean, his uniform was straight, his face was the particular shade of controlled fury that Nora had seen before on men who had been wrong about something important and had not yet decided how to process that fact. She was shutting down the engine when she heard his voice cut through the rotor noise. Captain Hayes, out of the aircraft, now. She finished the shutdown sequence, every step, in order, because the aircraft had just carried 6 people through a canyon under fire, and it deserved a proper shutdown, regardless of what Colonel Hargrove wanted, and because finishing the sequence gave her 11 more seconds to decide how she was going to handle whatever came next. She climbed out. The flight line was controlled, chaos around them, medics moving at speed, stretchers going toward the aid station, voices calling out vitals and blood types and surgical priorities. Owens was somewhere in that noise, she knew, moving with his brother, holding on with both hands to something he almost lost tonight. She could hear it all, and she didn't look at any of it, because Hargrove was standing 4 feet in front of her, and he had his finger up and his jaw tight, and he was about to say something. You disobeyed a direct order, he said. Yes, sir. I told you to stand down. Yes, sir. I told you, he stopped, started again. Do you understand what you just did? You took an unsupported aircraft into a hostile canyon solo, overloaded in zero visibility, in direct violation of standing operational protocol and my explicit command. You understand that? Yes, sir. Then why? He stopped again. And this time the stop was different. Not recalibrating his argument, actually stopping. Because 40 feet behind him, a medic had just called out Martinez's name, and the word stable had followed it, and Hargrove had heard it, and somewhere behind the fury, something shifted. He didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on Nora. You got lucky, he said finally. His voice was quieter now, not softer, just quieter. Nora looked at him for a long moment. She was tired in a way that went past the physical and into something structural, something in her bones, in her thinking, in the space behind her eyes. She was tired the way people get tired when they have spent the last 2 hours operating at the absolute edge of everything they know. And she was standing on a flight line in a sandstorm talking to a man who was angry at her for bringing everyone home alive. "Permission to speak freely, sir," she said. His jaw tightened. "Speak." "With respect," she said. "Luck is what you call it when you don't understand what happened." She held his gaze. "I knew that canyon. I had flown it. I had the aircraft, the training, and the information that the mission required. What I did not have was your permission." She paused. "I made a choice about which one mattered more tonight." The silence between them was the kind that has weight. Hargrove stared at her. She could see him processing not just what she said, but the fact that she had said it standing in front of him on a flight line at 2300 hours with rotor wash, still fresh on her flight suit, and 6 men alive behind her who were not alive 2 hours ago. "You're grounded," he said, "pending review." "Yes, sir." "Report to debrief at 0600. "Yes, sir." He held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned and walked away, and his boots were still clean, and his uniform was still straight, and he did not look back. Nora stood where she was for a moment. Then she turned toward the aid station. She needed to know they were all stable before she could sleep. That was not optional. That was just who she was. The aid station was 70 meters away, a prefab structure that smelled of antiseptic and controlled urgency, and she pushed through the door, and the flight surgeon, whose name was Kellerman, she remembered now. Dr. Kellerman, who had sat in the corner of the briefing room with his arms crossed, calculating blood requirements, looked up from a table where he had his hands inside someone's chest cavity and said without any preamble, "2 are in surgery, 3 are stable. 1 is critical but holding." "Which one is critical?" "Martinez." She nodded. "Owens' brother." "He's holding," Kellerman said again. Emphasis on holding. Not improving, not out of danger. Holding. She understood. She stepped back outside. The storm was still going. The sand was still moving. The desert did not care what had just happened on its floor, in its canyons, in its dark and violent air. It simply continued being the desert, indifferent, enormous patient in the way that only things without consciousness can be patient. Nora sat down on the step outside the aid station door. And for the first time since she had stood up in that briefing room and said the 4 words that changed everything, she allowed herself to feel how tired she was. It hit her like a physical thing. Not dramatic, just weight. Enormous accumulated patient weight, the kind that had been waiting outside the door of her focus for the last 2 hours and was now walking in since the door was finally open. She put her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands. She did not cry. That was not where she was. She was somewhere past the point where crying was the response and before the point where any other response had become available. She was simply sitting in the space between what had happened and what it meant, and she did not have the energy to do anything about either. "Hayes," she looked up. Reed was standing in front of her, not in the commanding officer posture he'd had in the briefing room, just standing in the way that men stand when they have been through something and are not performing anything for anyone. He sat down next to her on the step. Not a word for a moment, just the wind and the sand and the sounds of the aid station behind them. Then he said, "Hargrove's going to put it in your file." "I know. The review board meets in 2 weeks. It's going to be a conversation." "I know. I'll testify," he said. Simply, not as an offer, as a statement of what was already decided. "What you did tonight," he stopped. "The outcome justifies the decision. I'll make sure that's on record." She looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." He looked straight ahead. "I asked for a combat pilot. You were the only one who answered. The least I can do is make sure that doesn't cost you your career." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is Owens okay?" Reed nodded slowly. "He's with his brother. They won't let him in the surgical suite, but he's right outside the door." A pause. "He's not going anywhere." She looked down at her hands. The tremor was gone now. Her hands were completely steady, resting on her knees in the dark, and she thought about how strange that was, how the hands that had been shaking 30 minutes ago were now the calmest part of her, as if they had spent everything they had, and arrived at some kind of empty, quiet peace on the other side of it. "Can I ask you something?" Reed said. "Go ahead." "When you flew through that boulder gap," he paused. "Owens had the ISR feed on secondary display during your approach. He saw it." Another pause. "6 feet wide. Your aircraft is 6 feet at the skids." She didn't say anything. "What were you thinking?" he said. Not challenging, actually asking. She considered the question seriously the way she considered everything with full attention, stripping away the comfortable answers until she found the true one. "I was thinking about the gap," she said. "Not about the rotor disc, not about the wall, just the gap." She looked up. "If you think about what can go wrong in that situation, you'll fill the gap with the wrong thing." Reed looked at her for a long moment. "Most pilots would have gone over the boulders," he said. Going over meant 3 seconds of ridgeline exposure at low speed and overweight. Thermal imaging team had acquisition. 3 seconds was long enough for them to put a round through the engine housing. She shrugged a small movement. The gap was the safer choice. The gap was 6 feet wide. "The gap was what we had," she said. Reed was quiet. Then he said very quietly, mostly to himself, "God help us all if you're ever wrong about a gap." She almost smiled. "Yeah," she said, "God help us." They sat there for another minute side by side on the aid station step, two people who had been through the same event from completely different angles and were now trying to find the words that fit what it had been. Then the door behind them opened and Kellerman's voice came out, "Captain Hayes." She stood up immediately. Kellerman was in the doorway, still in surgical gloves, his expression doing the thing doctors' expressions do when the news is not what everyone was afraid it was going to be. "Martinez is out of surgery," he said. She waited. "He's going to make it." The breath that left her body in that moment was not dramatic. It was not a gasp or a sob or any of the things that happen in movies when the news is good. It was just air moving out of her lungs, taking something with it that had been sitting there since Owens had told her his brother's name on the flight line 2 hours ago. "Thank you," she said. Kellerman nodded and went back inside. Reed looked at her. She looked at the ground. "Okay," she said softly, to no one in particular. "Just okay." And then she heard it from somewhere inside the aid station through the prefab wall, the sound of a person crying who had been holding it for a very long time. Not in grief, the other kind. The kind that comes when something you were certain was going to be taken from you turns out to still be there, still breathing, still alive on the other side of something terrible. Owens. She turned away and walked toward the edge of the flight line because that moment belonged to him and not to her, and she was not interested in witnessing it. Some things are private, even in a place where privacy barely exists. She found a spot at the edge of the tarmac where the perimeter lights fell off into darkness, and she stood there and looked out at nothing, and the storm pushed against her, and she let it because she was too tired to push back, and because it didn't matter. Her aircraft was behind her, damaged and overloaded and still somehow functional because she had asked it to be. The 6 men who were alive because of the last 2 hours were in the aid station behind her, being put back together by people who knew how. Hargrove was somewhere inside headquarters, putting words in a file that would eventually lead to a conversation that she would have to have with a review board that would ask her questions she would answer honestly regardless of the consequences. All of that was real. All of that was tomorrow and the next day and the day after that. Right now, she was standing at the edge of the flight line with sand in her teeth and her hands in her pockets, and the engine still cooling somewhere behind her, and she was alive, and so were the 6 men she had gone to get. And that was the math that mattered. She stood there until the cold got serious about itself. Then she turned and walked toward the barracks. She was 10 feet from the door when she heard her name. "Captain Hayes?" She turned. It was one of the walking wounded. One of the 2 who had been able to move on his own when she landed in the canyon. She could tell by the way he was moving now. Careful but upright, arm in a field-expedient sling, face cleaned up but still carrying the marks of 4 hours in a combat situation. He was young, mid-20s, the kind of young that looks younger under fluorescent light when the adrenaline has finally worn off. He stopped a few feet from her and looked at her with the expression of someone who has prepared something to say and is now uncertain whether the words are adequate. "I'm Corporal Reyes," he said. "I was the one on the radio, Sierra Actual." She looked at him. He had been the voice in the canyon, the one who told her, "Too critical?" One not going to make it without intervention. the one who said, "We'll make it work." "Reyes," she said. "I wanted to—" He stopped, started again. "When I heard your rotors coming through that canyon, I didn't—" Another stop. He shook his head, slightly frustrated with himself. "I didn't think it was real. I thought it was the storm making sounds. Because we had given up on—" He stopped a third time, and this time he didn't start again immediately. She waited. "We had a conversation," he said finally. "The ones of us who were still conscious. About 40 minutes before you arrived. We had a conversation about what we were going to do when it became clear that no one was coming." His voice was steady. It was the steadiness of someone who has decided to say a difficult thing and is going to say it all the way through. Martinez was— He paused. Chen was telling him to hold on, to just keep holding on, and Martinez said another pause. He said he was tired. The wind moved between them. "And then we heard your rotors," Reyes said. "And Chen thought it was the storm, and I thought it was the storm, and then Martinez said—" He stopped, swallowed. He said, "That's not the storm. That's a helicopter. That's a very small helicopter, and it is coming for us." A pause. He smiled. In that condition, with everything, he smiled, because he knew. Nora looked at the young corporal in front of her, and she did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not diminish what he was giving her by telling her this. "I just wanted you to know," Reyes said, "what it meant when you came." She nodded once. He nodded back. Then he turned and walked toward the aid station with his arm in a sling and his boots scraping on the tarmac, and she watched him go until the door closed behind him. She stood in the dark for another moment. Then she went inside and she lay down on her bunk without taking off her flight suit, and she stared at the ceiling and she thought about a man in a canyon who was tired and who had looked up and who had heard something and who had smiled. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She did not dream. At 0400 hours, her radio crackled. She was awake before the second burst of static. That was just how it worked. You didn't so much sleep as exist in a state of reduced function that could be exited in under 2 seconds at the right frequency. Her hand found the radio before her eyes fully opened. "Hayes?" Reed's voice. Which was wrong because Reed did not call people at 0400 for good news. She sat up. "Go ahead," she said. "I need you in the operations center, right now." "What happened?" A pause. And in that pause, she felt the weight of something shifting the particular quality of air that a situation has when it has just gotten considerably more complicated. "The ISR feed from Sierra 9, Reed said. "Our analysts have been going through it since you extracted. They found something." Another pause. "The enemy personnel on that ridgeline, the ones with the thermal imaging." "What about the then?" "They weren't random," Reed said. "They knew the extraction point. They knew the grid. They knew the IR beacon frequency." His voice was flat and careful. "Hey, someone gave them the mission parameters before you went in." She was on her feet before he finished the sentence. "Someone in that briefing room," she said. "That's what we're looking at." The silence lasted 1 second. "I'm on my way," she said. She was out the door in 30 seconds, moving through the dark toward the operations center, with the storm still pushing at her back and her mind moving through the briefing room in sequence. 30 faces, 30 sets of eyes, 30 people who had heard the mission parameters, the grid reference, the beacon, frequency, the extraction, timeline. 30 people, one of whom had made a phone call, or sent a signal, or done something small, something that took seconds, that had put enemy personnel with thermal imaging on a ridgeline above a canyon where 6 men were bleeding and 1 young pilot was threading a 6-foot gap in the dark. She pushed through the operations center door. Reed was at the main table with 2 intelligence officers and a man she didn't recognize, civilian clothes, no rank insignia, the particular absence of identification that meant he carried more authority than the people in the room wearing uniforms. He looked up when she came in. "Captain Hayes," he said, not a greeting, an acknowledgement. "Who are you?" she said. He looked at Reed. Reed said, "He's with the agency. He's been working a mole investigation for the last 6 weeks. What happened tonight?" He paused. It wasn't the first time. She looked at the intelligence officers, at the civilian, at Reed. "How many times?" she said. The civilian said, 4 operations in 8 weeks. Every time the enemy had advanced knowledge, positions, timing, frequencies." He looked at her steadily. Tonight was the first time we had an ISR asset capturing the ridgeline in real time during an active operation, which means tonight is the first time we have evidence that is conclusive rather than circumstantial. Evidence of who? He opened a folder on the table and turned it toward her. She looked down. The photograph was a still capture from the ISR feed infrared, grainy, the kind of image that required a trained eye to interpret. But it had been enhanced and annotated, and the annotations pointed to a figure on the ridgeline, and next to the figure was a second capture, this one from a base security camera time-stamped 18 minutes before her departure. She looked at the second image for a long time. Then she looked up at Reed. Reed's face told her that he had looked at this photograph for the last 45 minutes and had arrived somewhere on the other side of shock and was now operating in the cold, difficult place that comes after. He was in the briefing room, she said. Yes, Reed said. He heard everything, the grid, the beacon frequency, the extraction timeline. Yes, she looked back at the photograph. The face in the security camera image was someone she recognized. Not well, not personally, but she had seen him in that room tonight, and she had registered him the way you register everyone in an operational briefing, as a professional, as a known quantity, as someone on the same side. Does he know we know? She said. Not yet, the civilian said. We have approximately 4 hours before the morning shift change creates conditions where he becomes aware of the investigation. 4 hours, she said. We need to move carefully, the civilian said. If we move incorrectly, I understand, she said. I understand careful. She looked at Reed, but I need you to understand something. Whatever careful looks like in the next 4 hours, those 6 men in the aid station are alive because we got there before the information he passed was fully actionable. She held his gaze. Next time, we might not. Reed looked at her for a long moment. There won't be a next time, he said. The civilian closed the folder. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to break. Not dramatically, just a gradual reduction in the wind's insistence, the sand settling by fractions, the air becoming something marginally closer to breathable. In the aid station across the base, Martinez was sleeping under sedation, with a surgical team's work holding him together, and Owens was in a chair outside the door, and Reyes was on a cot with his arm immobilized, probably not sleeping. And in the operations center, in the 40 minutes before 0500, 3 people looked at a photograph and decided what came next. Some things begin in a briefing room with a question and a silence and one person standing up. Some things begin in a canyon in the dark with a 6-foot gap and a choice made in 2 seconds. And some things begin at 400 with a radio call and a folder opened on a table and a face that shouldn't be where it is staring up from a grainy infrared photograph under the pale light of an operations center at the edge of the desert. This was the beginning of the third thing. The civilian's name was Carver. He didn't offer a last name and nobody asked because in the particular professional culture of people who show up at 0400 without rank insignia and open folders on tables, last names are a courtesy that gets extended only when someone decides you've earned it. He had been working the mole investigation for 6 weeks, he said, and the way he said it, flat without complaint, without drama, told Nora that 6 weeks meant 6 weeks of almost nothing, of circumstantial threads and inconclusive signals, and the particular grinding frustration of knowing something is wrong and being unable to prove it in a way that would survive a legal challenge. Tonight had changed that. The ISR asset captured a transmission from the ridgeline at 22:53. Carver said, spreading 3 enhanced photographs across the table. 11 minutes before you entered the canyon. The signal was encrypted, but the transmission signature matched a pattern we've been tracking for 4 operations. Same encryption protocol, same frequency rotation, same timing relative to mission launch. He tapped the first photograph. This is the person on the ridgeline receiving the transmission. The figure was indistinct infrared elevated position, the image degraded by distance and atmospheric interference. But the equipment was visible. A handheld device, a directional antenna. And this, Carver said, sliding the second photograph across, is the source of that transmission. Security camera, eastern perimeter, timestamp 2241, 12 minutes before you lifted off. The second photograph was clearer. Base security cameras were higher resolution than ISR feeds at altitude, and the eastern perimeter light had caught the figure at an angle that left very little room for interpretation. Nora had looked at it once at Reed's face and understood. Now she looked at it again more carefully. The man in the photograph was Staff Sergeant Dale Whitmore. 31 years old, 8 years of service, 2 combat deployments, a commendation for valor from his second deployment in a different theater. He was assigned to signals intelligence support, which meant he had legitimate reason to be near communications equipment at almost any hour, which meant his presence near the perimeter at 2241 would not have triggered any automated alert, which meant he had chosen his cover carefully and maintained it for long enough that 6 weeks of investigation had produced only circumstantial evidence. Until tonight. He was in the briefing room, Nora said. She wasn't asking. She was placing him there in her memory, running back through the 30 faces she had cataloged when she walked to the front of the room and stood next to Reed's map. 4th row right side, he had a notebook. Carver looked at her. You remember that specifically? I remember everyone in that room specifically, she said. I was looking at them while I was talking. It's a habit. Reed said, she's right. I checked the roster against my own recollection. Whitmore was in the room from the start of the briefing. So he heard everything, Carver said. Grid reference beacon, frequency extraction, timeline aircraft type. He paused. Aircraft type is significant. If he transmitted that the extraction vehicle was an MH-6, a light aircraft, single pilot, low and slow, the personnel on that ridgeline would have known exactly what kind of shot they were waiting for. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Nora said, where is he now, Barracks? Carver said. As of 30 minutes ago, he was in his rack. We have eyes on the building. He doesn't know we know. Correct. What's the plan? Carver and Reed exchanged a look. The kind of look that happens when 2 people have already had a portion of a conversation and are deciding how much of it to share with the third person in the room. Nora saw it. Whatever you're deciding to tell me, she said, tell me all of it. I flew through that canyon because someone in that room handed our position to the people shooting at us. I think I've earned the full picture. Reed said, fair enough. He looked at Carver. Tell her. Carver leaned back. Whitmore has a handler, someone outside the wire who manages the relationship, collects the intelligence, passes the payment. We've identified 3 probable meeting points he's used in the last 8 weeks, all within 12 kilometers of the base perimeter. The transmissions tonight were direct, no intermediary, which means he either couldn't reach the handler or the operation was too time-sensitive for the usual protocol. He paused. Which tells us the handler didn't know this was happening tonight either. Nora processed that. So the handler finds out tomorrow, when the Ridgeline team reports that the extraction succeeded. Yes. And when the handler finds out the extraction succeeded, Whitmore becomes a liability, Carver said. An operation that was supposed to end with 6 dead Americans and no witnesses instead ended with 6 live Americans who were on that canyon floor. The Ridgeline team will report what they saw. The handler will calculate the exposure risk. He looked at her steadily. Whitmore has maybe 48 hours before his own network decides he's more dangerous alive than dead. The weight of that sat in the room. Nora thought about a man asleep in the barracks 40 meters away, who did not know that the operation he had facilitated had failed, who did not know that the pilot he had tried to have killed was sitting in the operations center, right now looking at his photograph, who did not know that the clock on his own survival had started running while he slept. You want to use the window, she said. Carver said, we want to use the window. Before the handler finds out, before Whitmore knows we know, before he has any reason to run or go dark or, she stopped, or before his own network takes him off the board. Yes, Carver said, we have a narrow opportunity to let this play out in a way that gets us the handler and the network rather than just Whitmore. If we move on Whitmore now, we get one name. If we're patient. How patient? Reed said. Hours, not days. Carver looked at the clock on the wall. It read 0423. The handler's first communication window after a failed operation is typically at dawn. We have, he calculated, approximately 90 minutes before that window opens. I need a decision about how we handle the next 90 minutes. Reed looked at Nora. She was not sure why he was looking at her. She was a combat pilot, not an intelligence officer. She had no formal training in counterintelligence operations, no experience with mole hunts, no institutional knowledge of how the agency ran these situations. She had flown a helicopter through a canyon in a sandstorm. That was the entirety of her relevant expertise tonight. But Reed was looking at her, and she understood why, because she was the one in this room who had the clearest understanding of what Whitmore's information had almost cost, and that understanding was its own kind of expertise. "Let the window open," she said. "Let him make the transmission. Record everything, then move." Carver nodded slowly. "That was my recommendation." "Then we agree," she said. "What do you need from us?" "Patience," Carver said, "and silence. No one outside this room knows about the photograph or the investigation until I say so." He looked at Reed, then at Nora. "No one." Reed said, "Understood." Nora said, "Understood." Carver began making calls on a satellite phone he produced from somewhere inside his civilian jacket, speaking in the clip-coded shorthand of someone who was accustomed to having conversations that needed to be both efficient and deniable. Reed poured 2 cups of coffee from a thermos on the side table and handed one to Nora without asking whether she wanted it, because at 0430 the question was irrelevant. She took it. They waited. The next hour was the particular kind of slow that only happens when you are waiting for something that cannot be hurried. The operations center was quiet except for Carver's periodic calls and the low hum of equipment and the sound of the storm outside, which was still diminishing, settling towards something that was merely unpleasant rather than operationally limiting. At 0511, Reed's radio crackled. He stepped away to take the call, and Nora watched his face from across the room, reading it the way she read instruments for changes in baseline, for deviations that indicated something had shifted. His face changed. He came back to the table. "Martinez," he said. She stood up. One motion. Reed stopped. And then deliberately he finished the sentence. "He's awake. He's asking for water, and he wants to know if the pilot who got them out is okay." Reed looked at her with an expression that was controlled, but not quite. "Kellerman wanted you to know." She sat back down. She sat back down because standing required a steadiness she didn't currently have, and she was not going to fall over in an operations center at 0511 in front of a Navy SEAL captain and a CIA officer, because a man she had never met was awake and asking for water. She sat down and she put both hands flat on the table, and she breathed. "Good," she said. Her voice was steady. "That's good." Reed sat down across from her. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. They were two people who understood that sometimes the only response to a thing is to let it be real for a moment before you move on to the next thing. Carver looked up from his phone. He read the room. He looked back down at his phone. At 0537, everything changed. Carver's satellite phone buzzed. He looked at it. His expression, which had been consistently neutral in the way that trained professionals make their expressions consistently neutral, did something small and significant. Not a smile, just a shift. The shift of someone who has been hunting something for 6 weeks and has just been told it is in the net. "He's moving," Carver said. Reed was on his feet. "Whitmore left the barracks at 0534, Carver said, reading from the phone. "On foot, heading east. He's carrying a communications kit." "He's going to the transmission point," Reed said. "Before the dawn winded," Carver said. "He's not waiting for the scheduled time. Something spooked him." He looked up. Someone talked. The word landed in the room like a stone in still water, ripples going outward in every direction. Someone talked. Between the briefing in this room at 0400 and 0534, someone had said something to the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong volume, and Whitmore had heard it or been warned, and now he was moving at 0534 toward a transmission point with a communications kit, and the window that had been 90 minutes was now closing faster than any of them had planned for. "Do we move on him?" Reed said. "If we move on him now, we get Whitmore and nothing else," Carver said. "The handler goes dark the moment Whitmore misses his transmission. We lose the network. If we don't move on him, he transmits, and the handler burns everything." "Yes. So either way, we lose something," Carver said. "The question is which loss we can afford." The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Nora said, "Let me see the transmission point on the map." Both men looked at her. "I've flown that perimeter," she said. "Show me the point." Carver hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then he turned his satellite phone and showed her the GPS coordinate that his surveillance team had flagged as Whitmore's probable destination. She looked at it. She looked at the topographic layer. She looked at the distance from the base perimeter and the terrain between the transmission point and the two probable extraction routes Whitmore could use if he decided to run rather than transmit. He has one exit, she said. If he transmits and tries to run, there is one route that doesn't put him on open ground under your surveillance asset. She pointed at the map. This wadi, it runs northeast for 4 kilometers before it hits a road. If he's going to run, that's where he goes. Carver looked at the map, then at her. You're certain of it? I've flown it, she said, at low altitude in the dark. There is exactly one covered route out of that transmission point that avoids line of sight from the perimeter. I'm looking at it. Carver was on the phone before she finished talking. He gave coordinates in his coded shorthand and listened to the response and said 3 words she didn't catch and ended the call. We have an asset in position to cover the wadi, he said. If he runs into us. He looked at Reed, which means we can let him transmit. Reed looked at Nora, something in his expression that she couldn't quite name, not gratitude, something older than that. The look of a person who has been in enough situations to recognize the specific value of someone who knows the ground. Cover the wadi, Reed said. Let him transmit, then we move. Carver nodded and made another call. The next 18 minutes were the slowest of the night. Nora sat with her coffee going cold and her mind running the terrain northeast of the base in 3 dimensions, checking her memory against the map on Carver's phone, looking for errors in her own recollection. Because an error in her recollection meant a gap in the coverage, and a gap in the coverage meant Whitmore walked out of this, and the handler went dark in 4 operations, into Knight's Canyon, and 6 men who almost didn't come home, meant nothing in terms of the network that had been running intelligence against them for 8 weeks. She didn't find any errors. At 05:55, Carver's phone buzzed again. He read it. He's at the transmission point. A pause. He's transmitting. Reed said clock. Recording is active, Carver said. We have the signal. Another pause reading. Transmission complete. A pause. He's moving. He went north. A longer pause. He's heading for the wadi. Reed looked at Nora. She said nothing. She had told them where he would go, and he had gone there, and there was nothing more to say about it. Asset is in position, Carver said, reading from the phone with the focused calm of someone receiving a live operational feed. Subject is in the wadi. He's moving fast. A pause. He knows something is wrong. Another pause. Set has visual contact. A pause that stretched longer than the others. Subject is down, non-lethal. Asset has him. The operations center was very quiet. Reed exhaled through his nose. One long, controlled breath, the breath of someone releasing something they had been holding at significant personal cost. Carver said, we have Whitmore. Transmission is recorded. Handler acknowledged receipt before Whitmore moved, which means the handler doesn't know the network is compromised yet. He looked up. We have a window to work backward from the transmission to the handler's location. How long? Reed said. Hours, maybe less. Carver stood up. I need to make calls. He looked at Reed and Nora. What happened in this room tonight stays in this room until I say otherwise. Are we clear? Clear, Reed said. Nora nodded. Carver left. The door closed behind him, and the operations center was suddenly very quiet and very empty, in the way that places get when the specific tension that was filling them has been removed, leaving only the echo of what it felt like. Reed stood at the table with his hands flat on the map and his head down. Then he said without looking up, someone in this building warned him. Between 0400 and 0530, someone heard something they shouldn't have and passed it. Yes, Nora said, which means this isn't over. No, she said, it isn't. He looked up. How are you doing? The question surprised her not because it was inappropriate, but because it was so direct. Reed was not a man who asked how you were doing as a social gesture. He asked because he wanted the actual answer. She thought about it honestly. I'm tired, she said. I'm angry in a way I don't have the energy to fully feel yet. And she paused. I'm trying to figure out how I feel about the fact that someone in that briefing room and watched me walk out that door tonight and immediately picked up a communications device. Reed looked at her steadily. Because here's the thing, she said. When I walked out of that room to go prep my aircraft, I was thinking about the canyon. I was thinking about the approach, the wind, the weight limits, the wounded men at the extraction point. I was doing the math on whether I was going to come back. She paused. And someone in that room was watching me leave and thinking about how to make sure I didn't. The quiet between them was different from the other quiets of the night. Not the silence of a briefing room before a mission. Not the silence of an operations center during a tense wait. This was something more personal. The silence of two people sitting with a specific human ugliness, the kind that doesn't resolve cleanly, that doesn't have an operations center answer or a cover-the-wadi solution. "What do you need?" Reed said. "Sleep," she said. "And then I need to know who warned him." Reed nodded. "I'll find out." "I know you will." She stood up. "And Reed," she waited until he looked at her. "When you find out, I want to be in the room." He held her gaze for a moment. "You'll be in the room," he said. She walked out of the operations center into the early morning. The storm had broken fully. Now the air was clear and cold, and the desert was doing the thing it sometimes did after a storm, becoming very still and very present, as if it had exhausted its own violence and was resting. She walked toward the barracks. She passed the aid station on the way. The light was on inside. She could see it through the gap at the bottom of the door, the particular pale light of a medical facility that never fully goes dark. She stopped. She stood outside the door for a moment. Then she pushed it open. Kellerman was at the far end of the room writing in a chart. Two of the six were asleep in beds, their faces still carrying the marks of the canyon, but easier now, the particular ease of people whose bodies have been repaired enough to allow real rest. Owens was in a chair against the wall with his head back and his mouth slightly open, finally asleep himself with one hand resting on the edge of his brother's bed. Martinez was awake. He was looking at the ceiling, and when the door opened, he turned his head and he saw Nora. And he looked at her for a long moment. She stood in the doorway. He said quietly so as not to wake anyone, "You're the pilot." "Yes," she said. He looked at her. He was pale and he was connected to things, and he looked like a man who had been taken apart and put back together by people who knew what they were doing, which was exactly what he was. But his eyes were clear, present. The eyes of someone who had made a decision to stay in the world and was honoring that decision. "Reyes told me," he said, "about the gap." A pause. "The 6-foot gap." She said nothing. He said the rotor cleared the boulder by 18 inches. "Reyes is estimating," she said. "Is he wrong?" She looked at him for a moment. "Go back to sleep, Martinez." Something moved across his face. Not a smile exactly. More than that, the expression of a man who has been given back something he thought was gone and is still in the process of understanding the full weight of what he has been given. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She let the door close behind her. She walked the last 40 meters to the barracks in the clear, cold air of an early desert morning, and she went inside and she lay down on her bunk, and this time she didn't stare at the ceiling. She was asleep before she had time to think about what came next. She slept 4 hours and 20 minutes. Not because that was enough, it was nowhere near enough. But at 10:14, her radio went off, and Reed's voice came through with the particular edge that told her this was not a courtesy call, and 4 hours and 20 minutes was what she had. So that was what she used. She was upright before the second word. "Debrief has been moved," Reed said. 01100, Operations Center. Hargrove will be there. Carver will be there. And Hayes, there's someone else. "Who?" He paused. That told her everything before he answered. "General Whitfield. He flew in from Bagram at 0800. She sat on the edge of her bunk. Brigadier General Aaron Whitfield was not a name you heard in the context of routine operational reviews. He was the kind of general who appeared when something had happened that was too large or too complicated or too politically sensitive to be handled at the colonel level. He was the kind of general whose presence in a room meant that whatever happened next was going to matter in ways that extended well beyond this base, this desert, this operation. "What does he know?" she said. "Everything," Reed said. Carver briefed him on the flight in. The canyon extraction, Whitmore, the transmission, the handler. A pause. "He's seen your file, Hayes. He asked for it specifically." She stood up. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. She was there in 14. The operations center had been rearranged, the side tables cleared, chairs placed in a configuration that was more formal than the 0400 working session she had left 4 hours ago, a formality that communicated that what was about to happen was on the record in ways that the previous conversation had not been. Carver was at the far end of the table with a laptop and a satellite phone and the same neutral expression he had worn all night, which Nora was beginning to understand was not coldness but discipline, the practiced containment of a person who could not afford to let what he felt interfere with what he needed to think. Reed was standing near the door. He looked at her when she came in and gave her the smallest nod, the kind that means I've got you without saying anything out loud that could be witnessed or recorded. Hargrove was there. He was seated already back straight, hands flat on the table, the posture of a man who had spent the hours between their flight line confrontation and this meeting, deciding exactly what position he was going to take and was now committed to it. He did not look at her when she walked in, and at the head of the table sat General Whitfield. He was older than she expected, late 50s, the kind of face that had been through enough sun and stress to look like it had been shaped by the desert itself. He was not large. He was not performing authority. He simply had it the way some people carry weight without any visible effort, and the room organized itself around him without anyone deciding to make that happen. He looked at her when she walked in, directly, not assessing he had already assessed she understood during the flight from Bagram when Carver had briefed him. He was just looking the way people look when they want to put a face to a decision. "Captain Hayes," he said, "sit down." She sat. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he opened the folder in front of him and began. "At 23:07 last night," he said, "you extracted 6 personnel from Canyon Sierra 9 in an MH6 rated for 4 solo without authorization in 0 visibility under fire in direct violation of a standing order from Colonel Hargrove." He looked up. "Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir," she said. "And you are aware that what you did constitutes a breach of operational protocol that under normal circumstances would result in a formal reprimand and possible removal from flight status?" "Yes, sir." "Are you also aware," he said, and his tone shifted, not softer but different, "that the 6 personnel you extracted include 2 recipients of the Silver Star, 1 recipient of the Medal of Honor, and the senior non-commissioned officer of one of the most operationally active SEAL teams currently deployed in this theater?" She had not known that last part. She kept her expression level. "I was not aware of the specific decoration, sir. I knew they were alive and they needed extraction." Whitfield looked at her steadily. Then he looked at Hargrove. "Colonel," he said. Hargrove straightened. "Sir, Captain Hayes acted in direct disregard of my order to stand down. While the outcome was," he paused, choosing his word carefully, "favorable, the breach of command authority cannot be overlooked. If we allow this precedent—" "Colonel," Whitfield's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "I've read your order. I've also read the operational timeline. At the moment you gave Captain Hayes the stand-down order, you had no viable alternative extraction plan. Is that correct?" A pause. "We were exploring options, sir. The men in that canyon had 90 minutes. Your exploration of options was not going to produce a viable plan inside that window. Is that also correct?" The pause was longer this time. "The conditions were, Colonel, yes or no?" Hargrove's jaw tightened. "No viable plan was available at that time, sir." "Thank you." Whitfield looked back at Nora. "Captain Hayes, walk me through the decision at the canyon entrance, the boulder field." She had not expected that specific question. She looked at him and understood that Carver had briefed him in detail, not just the operational summary, but the specific moments, the specific decisions, the specific margins. "There was a debris field across the primary approach route," she said, "approximately 30 feet wide. My options were to gain altitude and go over it, which would have given the thermal imaging team on the East Ridgeline a 3 to 4 second acquisition window at low speed with an overweight aircraft, or to thread a gap on the left side of the debris field, approximately 6 feet wide, and your rotor disc clearance at that speed and altitude. 18 inches on the near side, sir, possibly less. I was making the calculation in real time." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "Most pilots would have gone over." "Most pilots would have been correct to go over," she said. "The gap was not a textbook choice. It was the choice that the specific situation produced when I ran the math on both options." She paused. "The Ridgeline team had thermal imaging and they had acquisition. Going over that debris field in an overloaded aircraft at low speed was a longer exposure than I was willing to accept. You made that calculation in how much time?" 4 seconds, maybe less." Whitfield looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Reed. "Captain Reed," he said, "your assessment of what happened last night." Reed said, 6 men are alive who would not be alive without Captain Hayes's decision to stand up in that briefing room and her execution of an extraction that was by any objective measure outside the boundaries of what that aircraft and those conditions were designed to accommodate. He paused. She identified the threat vector, she identified the approach, and she identified the information that subsequently led to the detention of Staff Sergeant Whitmore and the ongoing operation to roll up his network. He looked at Whitfield directly. In my assessment, Sir Captain Hayes did not violate the spirit of command authority last night. She exercised it when no one else would. The room was very quiet. Hargrove said, "That is a creative interpretation of Colonel." Whitfield held up one hand, not sharply, just definitively. The hand of a man who has decided which direction the conversation is going and is indicating that alternatives are no longer on the table. He looked at Hargrove for a moment. Then he looked back at his folder. He turned a page. At 05:55 this morning, Whitfield said, Staff Sergeant Dale Whitmore was detained in a wadi approximately 3 kilometers northeast of this base while attempting to flee following an unauthorized transmission to a known hostile intelligence network. He looked up. The transmission has been analyzed. In addition to standard intelligence reporting, it contained a specific item that I want Captain Hayes to hear directly. He looked at Carver. Carver opened his laptop. The transmission included a request Whitmore asked his handler to, and I'm reading the translated text verbatim, confirm whether the pilot of the extraction aircraft had been neutralized. A pause. The handler's response, which we also captured, was unknown. Assessed negative, pilot likely survived. Whitmore's follow-up sent 40 seconds later was understood, advise on timeline for correction. The word correction sat in the operations center like something with mass. Timeline for correction. Nora heard it. She processed it the way she processed everything, with full attention, stripping away the surface of the words to understand their actual meaning. Whitmore, lying in his bunk at 05:30, had sent a message asking whether she was dead. When told she was probably alive, he had asked how quickly that could be fixed. She had been asleep 40 meters away while someone asked how quickly she could be killed. She looked at the table in front of her. She was not afraid. She noticed that specifically the absence of fear where fear might have been expected. What she felt was something colder and more specific than fear. The particular feeling of understanding that something you participated in has not actually ended yet. That the mission she had flown last night, which she had allowed herself to believe was complete, when the skids touched the flight line and the medics came running, was not complete. It had simply moved into a different phase. The handler, she said. Her voice was level. Where are we on the handler? Carver said. The transmission this morning gave us a location signature. We have a probable position within a 12-kilometer radius. My people are working it. He paused. We expect to have something actionable within 6 hours. And until then, she said. Until then, Carver said the handler believes the operation was partially successful, that the extraction failed or was compromised based on Whitmore's final transmission. The handler does not know Whitmore is in custody. The handler does not know the network is compromised. He paused. Which gives us a window. Another window, she said. Yes. She looked at Whitfield. He was watching her with the expression of a man who had asked a specific kind of person to sit down in front of him and was getting the specific kind of answer he had expected, which was different from a comfortable answer, but was more useful. Sir, she said, what is this meeting actually for? Whitfield looked at her, a long, steady look. This meeting, he said, is to inform you that the formal review of last night's operational decisions has been completed at my level. The finding is that Captain Hayes exercised sound tactical judgment under conditions that exceeded established parameters, and that the outcome justified the methodology. He closed the folder. There will be no reprimand. There will be no removal from flight status. He paused. There will also be a commendation entered into your record for the extraction and for the intelligence contribution that led to the Whitmore detention. Hargrove said nothing. His face said everything. Whitfield looked at him once. Colonel Hargrove, you are a capable officer, and your concerns about command authority are not without merit in the abstract. In this specific situation, your stand-down order, if followed, would have resulted in 6 dead Americans and an active intelligence asset continuing to operate undetected. He paused. I expect you to sit with that for a while. Hargrove sat with it visibly. It looked uncomfortable. That's all, Whitfield said. People began to stand, to gather things. The particular organized dispersal of a formal meeting that has reached its conclusion. Carver was already on his phone. Reed was moving toward the door. Hargrove stood and walked out without looking at anyone, which was its own kind of answer to a question nobody had asked out loud. Whitfield said, "Hayes, stay a moment." She stayed. When the room was empty, Whitfield closed the folder and looked at her without the formal architecture of the meeting surrounding them. Just two people in an operations center at 1100 hours, with coffee going cold on the side table and everything that had happened in the last 12 hours sitting between them. "I read your file on the flight in," he said. "Yes, sir. 7 years. Light attack, 3 combat deployments, 1 previous commendation, 2 letters of appreciation, 1 informal reprimand for an unauthorized flight path during a recon operation 8 weeks ago." He looked at her. "Canyon Sierra 9. She said nothing. "You flew the Canyon 8 weeks ago," he said. "Unauthorized, which is why you knew it last night." He paused. "Which means the unauthorized flight you were informally reprimanded for is the direct reason 6 men are alive today." She looked at him steadily. "I was aware of that, sir." "You imagine you were." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer." "Yes, sir." "When you stood up in that briefing room last night," he said, "when you heard the question and the room stayed silent, what were you actually thinking? Not the tactical calculation. Before the tactical calculation." She considered the question the way she considered everything, fully, without the comfortable answer. "I was thinking about the silence," she said, "not the mission. The silence, 30 people in a room who all knew the math and were all deciding that the math was someone else's problem." She paused. "And I was thinking that I had flown that canyon. I had the specific information the mission required, and if I sat in that silence knowing what I knew," she stopped. "The silence becomes a decision. It just becomes a decision you never have to own out loud." Whitfield looked at her for a long time. "You understand," he said slowly, "that what you're describing is the reason we lose good people. The room full of qualified individuals who all decide the problem belongs to someone else." "Yes, sir." "And you also understand that what you did last night, standing up in that room, going into that canyon, threading that gap, is not something that can be trained. Not formally, not in any program I've seen." He paused. "It is either in a person or it is not." She said, "With respect, sir, I think it's in more people than we know. I think a lot of people have it and don't know they have it because no one has ever put them in a room where the silence goes long enough for them to find out." Whitfield looked at her. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile. The expression of someone who has heard something that surprised them and is deciding what to do with the surprise. He said, "You have a meeting at 1400 with Carver. He's going to ask you to participate in the next phase of the handler operation. You don't have to say yes." He paused. "But I think you're going to." She looked at him. "Am I being ordered, sir?" "No," he said. "You are being asked. There is a difference, as you demonstrated last night." He stood. "I'll see you at the briefing." He walked out. The operations center was empty. Nora sat at the table for a moment in the quiet that follows the end of something that has not quite ended. She thought about Whitmore in custody, somewhere being asked questions by people who were very good at asking questions. She thought about a handler 12 kilometers away who was receiving incomplete information and making incorrect assumptions about what had survived the night. She thought about the 6 men in the aid station who were going to wake up tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, because of a 4-second decision made in a rock corridor 30 feet wide. She thought about Reyes saying we had a conversation about what we were going to do when it became clear no one was coming. She thought about Martinez awake in a hospital bed asking if the pilot was okay. She thought about Owens's brother and the sound through a prefab wall of a person crying because something they were certain was gone turned out to still be there. She stood up. She walked out into the midday heat, and she crossed the base toward the aid station because she had a meeting at 1400 and she had something to do before then, and the something was simple and did not require authorization or tactical planning or a room full of senior officers. She pushed through the aid station door. Kellerman looked up. "Captain?" "How are they?" she said. "Better than they have any right to be," he said. which from Kellerman she was learning was the closest thing to an unqualified positive assessment she was likely to get. Chen was asleep. Wilson was sitting up, looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of someone whose body is healing faster than his mind is processing what his body went through. Reyes was awake, arms still immobilized, and he looked at her when she came in with an expression of recognition that carried more weight than a salute. Martinez was awake, and next to Martinez in the chair against the wall was Owens. Not asleep this time. Awake, sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, talking to his brother in a low voice. He looked up when she entered. He stood up. "Captain Hayes," he said. "Sergeant," she said. "How is he?" Owens stopped. He was a young man who had been through more in the last 14 hours than most people go through in a year, and the sleep and the relief and the residual fear and the gratitude had all run together into something that was difficult to organize into words. "He's going to be okay," he said. "They said he's going to be okay." She nodded. Martinez said from the bed, "She knows I'm going to be okay." She saw the gap. His voice was dry, not weak, just careful. The voice of someone who was using his energy deliberately. 18 inches. He looked at Nora. "You flew me home on 18 inches of clearance." "You flew yourself home," she said. "You told Reyes to hold on. You stayed conscious through the skid carry. You held on for the whole flight." She looked at him steadily. "I just provided the transportation." Something happened in Martinez's face. Something that had been held carefully in place, maintained through the night, in the surgery, in the waking up, in the process of understanding that he was still alive. Something that let go quietly without drama. The way things let go when the crisis is finally over and the body decides it is safe to stop performing survival. He looked at her. He said, "Thank you." 2 words. The most inadequate words in any language for what he meant. He knew it and she knew it, and neither of them said anything about the inadequacy because there were no adequate words, and they were both people who understood that sometimes the real thing exists underneath the words rather than in them. "Get some sleep," she said. She turned to leave. Owens said, "Captain." She stopped. He was standing very straight, the posture of a soldier who wants to say something correctly and is using the posture to help himself do it. "I need to say something about what I said on the flight line last night, before you lifted." He paused. "When I told you my brother was one of the critical." "You needed me to know," she said. "Yes, but also," he stopped. I was not trying to manipulate you. I wasn't trying to give you a reason to go that you didn't already have. He stopped again. I needed to say his name out loud to someone who was going to the place where he was. I don't know if that makes sense." She looked at the young sergeant with his hands at his sides and his eyes steady and his brother breathing in a bed 3 feet away. "It makes complete sense," she said. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone receiving something they needed. She walked out. The 1400 meeting was in the same operations center, smaller group this time. Carver Reed, 2 intelligence officers she hadn't seen before, and a communications specialist who set up equipment with the brisk efficiency of someone who does this in different rooms in different countries on short notice and has stopped noticing the rooms. Carver laid it out in 12 minutes. The handler had responded to Whitmore's final transmission. The response included a location coordinate, not the handler's location, but a meeting point. A contingency extraction prearranged to be used if an asset needed to move quickly. The coordinate was 40 kilometers east. The scheduled window was at 1900 hours that evening. The handler was going to be at that coordinate at 1900 expecting Whitmore. Whitmore was in custody. The window was 8 hours away. "We can put assets at the coordinate before the window opens," Carver said. "Ground Team ISR coverage communications intercept. When the handler arrives and Whitmore does not, the handler will attempt to leave. We contain." He paused. "The coordinate is in a valley, single access route, vehicle approach." He paused again. "The valley has an overflight corridor." He looked at Nora. She looked at the map. The valley was 12 kilometers east of a position she had flown 3 weeks ago. She knew the corridor. She had filed it in the same part of her memory where she filed Canyon Sierra 9, obsessively, completely, with the specific attention of a pilot who understands that the terrain she flies over is eventually the terrain she might need to fly through. "You want eyes in the corridor," she said, "in case the ground team needs air support for containment. Or in case the handler doesn't come alone," Carver said. We're planning for Whitmore acting alone. The network may have assessed differently. If there's a vehicle escort, the ground team cannot handle a vehicle escort and a foot pursuit simultaneously, he said, not with the assets currently available. He paused. A fast, low, dark aircraft in that corridor at zero engagement posture changes the equation significantly. She looked at the map for a moment. Then she looked at Reed. He was watching her, not telling her anything with his expression, just watching, giving her the full space of the decision, the way he had given her the full space of the decision in the briefing room last night, because Reed was a person who understood that there are some things that have to be chosen rather than ordered. She looked back at Carver. My aircraft is damaged, took some hits on the approach, and the rotor system needs inspection before I put it back in the air. We know, Carver said. Maintenance has been working it since 0700. Chief Warrant Officer Samuel says it will be flight ready by 15:30. She looked at the clock on the wall. It read 14:08. She had 2 hours. What's the ceiling at the valley at 1900, she said. Carver looked at the communications specialist who checked a display. Clear, storm has moved east, visibility unlimited. Wind 015 at valley floor, gusting 20. She nodded. I'll need the approach corridor mapped to my FLIRO, she said, and I need a direct channel to the ground team commander. Done, Carver said, and if the handler has an escort and I have to make myself known. Rules of engagement are self-defense and defense of ground team, Carver said. You do not engage unless ground team is compromised. Understood. She paused. One more thing. Go ahead. She looked at him steadily. Last night, someone in this building warned Whitmore between 0400 and 0530. You know that? I know that. The warning compromised the operational security of the Whitmore detention and almost gave him a clean exit. She paused. Who was it? The room was very quiet. Carver looked at her. Then he looked at the two intelligence officers who both found something on their laptops to examine carefully. We have an identification, Carver said. It's being handled. Handled how? Handled at a level above this room, he said. Not evasive, informative, telling her that it was real and it was in motion and it was not being ignored. You will have a full debrief within 72 hours. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. 15:30, she said, I will be at the aircraft. She was at the aircraft at 15:12. Chief Warrant Officer Samuels was under the tail rotor assembly with a light and a focused expression when she arrived. He rolled out, looked at her, and said, She's not pretty, but she'll fly. He paused. Main rotor system is solid. I replaced 2 pitch links and retorqued the Jesus nut. You took a round through the fuel cell fairing non-penetrating, structural only patched. FLAR mount was loose resecured. He stood up. She carried 6 people out of a canyon last night. She's entitled to look a little rough. She earned it, Nora said. She ran the pre-flight herself, every step, every check, because the aircraft had earned the care and because she was going back into the air in less than 2 hours and because there is no shortcut in a pre-flight that does not eventually present itself at the worst possible moment. At 15:47, she climbed into the cockpit. At 16:03, she lifted off. The desert was different in the late afternoon without the storm, open, enormous entirely. Itself the kind of landscape that requires nothing from you and offers nothing in return, and is honest about both in a way that Nora had always found clarifying. She flew east into the clean air and found the valley corridor and flew it twice in both directions at low altitude, filing every feature into the part of her memory that operated separately from fear. And when she was satisfied, she climbed to altitude and set up a holding pattern and waited. The ground team was in position by 17:30. She could hear their radio traffic on the secondary channel clip professional, the sound of people who are very good at being very still in very difficult terrain. At 18:42, a vehicle appeared at the valley entrance. Single vehicle, one driver visible on FLIR, moving at a speed that suggested purpose rather than caution, someone who expected to arrive at an agreed location and meet an agreed person and leave without complication. The handler did not know the night had changed everything. Ground Team Tango 674, Nora said. Single vehicle, one visible occupant inbound from the east. Estimated arrival at coordinate in 4 minutes. 674 ground lead copy. Maintain corridor. Do not engage unless directed. Copy. She flew her holding pattern and watched the vehicle on FLIR and the ground team on FLIR and the valley on FLIR, and she thought about a briefing room in a silence and 4 words spoken without quite deciding to speak them, and she thought about how a decision made in the back row of a plywood shack at 2300 hours had led in a chain of events that no one had planned or predicted. To this valley at 1846 with a vehicle driving toward a meeting that was not going to be what anyone in that vehicle expected. 674 ground lead. Vehicle is at the coordinate. Stand by. She stood by. 60 seconds. 674 ground. Lead. Contact. We have the subject. No escort. No complications. A pause. Stand down from corridor. We have it from here. She banked out of the holding pattern and turned west. Toward the base. Toward the flight line. Toward the aid station where 6 men were breathing because of the night before. Toward an operations center where Carver would spend the next hours pulling a network apart, name by name and location by location, until the thing that had been running intelligence against them for 8 weeks was simply done. She flew west into the late sun, and the desert was red and gold beneath her, and the aircraft that had carried 6 people out of a canyon on 18 inches of clearance hummed under her hands with the particular frequency she knew the way. You know someone's breathing in a dark room. She thought about what Whitfield had said, that what she had done was either in a person or it was not. She thought he was wrong about that, not wrong about her, wrong about the general principle. She thought about every pilot in that room who had looked at the math and decided the math belonged to someone else. She did not think they were cowards. She thought they were people who had not yet been in a situation where the silence went long enough and the stakes were clear enough, and the specific knowledge was present enough for them to discover what was actually in them. She thought that was a different thing from not having it. She thought most people were one specific situation away from finding out who they actually were. And the tragedy was that most people never got put in that room with that question hanging in that silence. So they went through their entire lives never knowing. She was almost glad she had been there. Almost. She keyed the radio. Sierra Base Tango 674, inbound, ETA 12 minutes. Copy 674. A pause, and then Reed's voice replacing the duty officer's. Good flight, Hayes, come on home. She flew the last 12 miles in the quiet of a desert evening, the aircraft steady under her hands, the base lights appearing on the horizon exactly where they were supposed to be, and she brought the little bird down to the flight line with the particular precision of a pilot who knows her aircraft and her limits and the difference between the two. The skids touched. The rotor spun down. The desert settled around her. She sat in the cockpit for a moment, not shaking this time, not staring at nothing, just sitting in the quiet in the aircraft that had done something it was not designed to do because she had asked it to, and it had answered. She thought about Martinez saying, "That's not the storm. That's a helicopter," and smiling. She thought about Reyes saying, "We heard your rotors, and I didn't think it was real." She thought about Owens needing to say his brother's name out loud to someone who was going to the place where he was. She climbed out. She put her feet on the tarmac, and the desert air was cooling toward evening. And somewhere in a valley 40 kilometers east, a handler was answering questions that were going to unravel 8 weeks of damage. And somewhere in an aid station 70 meters away, 6 men were alive and getting more alive by the hour. And somewhere in a detention facility, a man named Whitmore was sitting with the consequences of what he had chosen. And Captain Nora Hayes, 5'4", still wearing the same flight suit and with the grease stain on the left forearm, still carrying the particular exhaustion of a person who has been operating at the edge of everything they know for 20 hours, walked away from her aircraft across the flight line toward whatever came next, because the mission was not the night in the canyon or the valley at sunset or even the handler in custody. The mission was everything that followed from one person refusing to stay seated when the room went silent. She had stood up. Everything else was just what happened because of that. That was the story she told herself on the walk across the flight line, and it was true. It was also not finished, because there was one thing that had not followed from her standing up, one thing that had begun in that same plywood room and had not yet ended. The first silence in the briefing shack had been a silence she could understand. 30 people doing the math and deciding the math belonged to someone else. That kind of silence was human. It was cowardice, and it was caution, and it was self-preservation, and none of those things were evil. They were just the ordinary weight of being a person who wants to keep breathing. But there had been a second silence, and that one was different. Somewhere between 400 and 530, while Nora slept 4 hours and 20 minutes in a barracks bunk 40 meters from the man who had tried to have her killed someone inside the wire, had picked up a piece of information they were never supposed to have and carried it to Whitmore in the dark. Someone had heard the word investigation, understood what it meant, and decided that a traitor's life was worth more than the truth. That silence had a face. It had a name. And it was still walking around the base, eating in the same mess hall, sleeping under the same desert sky, performing loyalty for an audience that had not yet learned to doubt it. Nora had told Reed she wanted to be in the room when they found out who it was. Reed had said she would be. She intended to hold him to it. The debrief Carver had promised came on the morning of the third day. By then the storm was a memory, and the desert had gone back to its enormous indifference. The sky a hard flat blue that pressed down on the base like a lid. The 6 men in the aid station had begun the slow business of becoming people again. Chen was walking the length of the prefab and back twice an hour, his jaw set against a pain he refused to name. Wilson had started making jokes, bad ones, the deliberately terrible kind that men make when they have decided to live and need to find out whether the world is still funny. Reyes had his arm out of the immobilizer for 20 minutes a day. Martinez was sitting up, eating solid food, and asking the doctors questions they didn't want to answer about when he could fly again himself. And Owens had not left his brother's side for more than 2 hours at a stretch. Nora knew all of this because she checked. Every morning. Not because anyone asked her to, but because the checking was not optional for her. In the same way that finishing a shutdown sequence was not optional. In the same way that hugging the left wall of a canyon was not optional, once you knew the downdraft sat in the center. Some things you did because they were correct, and the correctness did not require a witness. The operations center was configured the way it had been for Whitfield's review formal. On the record, the chairs squared. Carver was at the head of the table with his laptop and his neutral face and a stack of folders that had grown considerably since the night in the canyon. Reed stood by the door as he always did, in the position of a man who wanted a clear line to everyone in the room at once. Whitfield had flown back to Bagram, but was on a secure line, a small speaker in the center of the table carrying the faint hiss of 40 kilometers of encryption. And in the second row of chairs sat the 2 intelligence officers Nora had last seen at the 0400 working session, the night the whole thing had still been alive and moving. She remembered them now the way she remembered terrain, without trying, the way her brain filed anything that might one day matter. Sorensen was the one who talked. A captain young for the work, eager in the manner of people who have not yet learned that competence is quieter than enthusiasm. He had asked good questions that night, the kind that move an investigation forward, and he had asked too many of them, and Carver had let him because the questions were useful even when the volume was not. Doyle was the one who didn't. A chief warrant officer somewhere in his late 40s, the longest-serving intelligence professional on the base by a margin of years. He had been there before, any of them, before Reed, before Hargrove, certainly before Nora. He knew the base the way she knew the canyon, every route, every rhythm, every name attached to every face, attached to every job. He was the man Carver turned to when he wanted not data, but context, not the signal, but the meaning of the signal. In the 400 session, Doyle had spoken exactly 4 times, and every one of the 4 had been correct, and Nora had filed him away as the most dangerous kind of competent, the kind that does not need to be seen. She had not thought about him again until this morning. This morning, she could not stop. "We have the network," Carver said without preamble, because Carver did not believe in preamble. "Most of it. Whitmore gave us names once he understood his own position. The handler gave us more. We've rolled up 4 collectors and 2 couriers across 2 provinces in the last 72 hours, and there are 3 more we'll have by the end of the week." He set down a folder. "The operation that put 6 men in that canyon is finished. It will not run again. I want that on the record first, because everything I'm about to say next is harder, and I don't want it to drown out the part where you should feel that this worked." "But," Nora said. Carver looked at her. "But," he agreed, "there's the matter of the warning." The room went still in the particular way that rooms go still, when everyone in them already knows the shape of the thing about to be said. "Here is what we know," Carver said. At 0400 hours on the night of the extraction, 6 people in this building knew that Whitmore was under investigation. Reed, Hayes, myself, Captain Sorensen, Chief Doyle, and 1 duty technician who was running the surveillance feed and never left the secure room. He laid out the names like cards. At 0534, Whitmore left his barracks carrying a communications kit and moved toward a transmission point he had not been scheduled to use. He was not following a routine. He was running. which means that sometime between 400 and 534, the window of 94 minutes, one of those 6 people told Whitmore that we knew. 5, Reed said quietly. Hayes was asleep. We have her on the barracks camera entering at 0608 and not leaving. 5 to Carver aloud. And the duty technician never left the secure room, which is on continuous record. 4. Read in yourself, Nora said. You can rule us out or not as your conscience requires, Carver said, and there was no offense in it. I've ruled us out because I have to start somewhere, and I've watched both of us bleed for this. That leaves 2. He did not look at the second row. He did not have to. Sorensen. Doyle. Sorensen's face did something young and terrible, the look of a man who has just understood that he is for the first time in his career a suspect rather than an investigator. He started to speak. Carver lifted one finger and he stopped. We've pulled everything, Carver said. Every device, every access log, every transmission off this base in that window. There is no signal, no email, no radio, no satellite burst, no cell, nothing electronic left this base between 0400 and 0534 that we cannot account for. He spread his hands, which is a problem because it means the warning was not sent. It was carried by a person on foot in the dark. And a person on foot does not leave a log. The silence that followed was the kind Nora recognized. It was the kind that becomes a decision if you let it sit long enough. And so she did not let it sit. Then you don't need a signal, she said. You need a route. Every face in the room turned toward her, the same slow rolling tide of attention she had felt in the briefing shack 3 nights ago, moving from front to back as people registered a voice coming from a direction they hadn't been watching. Explain, Whitfield said from 40 kilometers away through the small speaker. Nora stood up. She did it without quite deciding to the way she had done it the first time, and she walked to the map on the wall. Not the canyon map now, but the base schematic, the one that showed every structure and road and perimeter line in the flat overhead geometry that she had spent 7 years learning to read at a glance. You're thinking about this like an intelligence problem, she said. It isn't. It's a terrain problem. The warning had to physically travel from a person who knew at 0400 to Whitmore's barracks before 0534. So forget who. Start with how. There are only so many ways to cross this base on foot in the dark without being seen. And I've flown over every one of them at 200 feet with a thermal camera, which means I know exactly where the cover is and exactly where it isn't. She put her finger on the operations center. This is where the 4 of us were. Here. She traced. The most direct route to Whitmore's barracks runs past the motor pool across the open ground by the fuel point and along the eastern walk. That route is covered by 3 perimeter cameras, and it's lit. You walk it at 0500, you're on film 4 separate times. Nobody who wanted to warn a traitor takes that route. Her finger moved. There's a second way, longer. It goes behind the maintenance hangar, through the gap between the hangar and the generator shed along the drainage line, and comes up on the barracks from the north side. She tapped the spot. That route has exactly 1 camera, and the camera covers the hangar door, not the gap. There's a 4-meter section in that gap where the generator shed blocks the camera's angle and the hangar blocks the perimeter floods. 4 meters of full darkness. It's the only place on this base where a person can stand in the open at night and not be seen by anything. She turned around. Whoever carried that warning went through that gap. There's no other way to make the timeline work without me showing up on a camera, and Whitmore showed up nowhere and neither did anyone else, which means they all knew the gap was there. She looked at Carver. I'd put your surveillance on that 4 meters of ground if I were you. Footprints, fibers, whatever your people pull. The storm had broken by 0500. The dirt back there would have held a track clean. Carver was already writing, but Whitfield's voice came through the speaker slow and deliberate, and it asked the question that mattered. Captain Hayes, how do you know the camera angle in that gap? And here was the thing she had been circling since the morning she walked back from the operations center at 0602. The small wrong detail her brain had logged and filed and refused to let go of the way it had refused to let go of a boulder gap in a canyon she had flown only once. Because I walked past it, she said. On the morning after the extraction, 0602, I was going from the ops center to my barracks, and I took the long way because I wanted the cold air. She paused. And there was a man coming out of that gap, out of the 4 meters of dark. coming toward me from the north from the direction of Whitmore's barracks at a little after 6 in the morning, with the storm just broken and the light still gray. She held the room. I filed it as nothing. An intelligence officer up early walking the wire checking the base after a bad night. That's a completely normal thing for that person to be doing. I didn't think about it again until this morning. Who, Whitfield said. She did not look at the second row. She did not have to. Chief Doyle, she said. What happened next did not happen the way it happens in films. There was no shout, no overturned chair, no lunge for the door. Doyle did not move at all. He sat in the second row with his hands flat on his knees, in the posture of a man who had spent 20 years learning to keep his face still, and he kept it still now. And the stillness itself was the confession, because Sorensen in the chair beside him had gone white and rigid and openly horrified in the way of a man watching his own innocence be established by someone else's guilt. And Doyle had done nothing at all. He had simply sat there with the practiced calm of a person who had always known this morning might come and had decided long ago exactly how he would meet it. Carver looked at him for a long moment. "Chief," he said almost gently, "is there anything you'd like to say before I make a phone call?" Doyle was quiet. Then he said in a voice that was steadier than anyone in the room had a right to expect, "She's right about the gap. I always thought that was the one flaw in the camera coverage. I flagged it 3 years ago." A pause. Nobody fixed it. I stopped mentioning it. He looked for the first time at Nora. "I didn't think a pilot would know it was there." "I fly over it," she said. "That's the whole job, knowing what's down there." Something moved across his face, not quite regret, not quite anything she could name. The expression of a man who had built his entire survival on the assumption that no one was paying close enough attention and had just learned that one person had been paying attention the entire time out of nothing more than the habit of it. The phone call was made. 2 security personnel came. Doyle stood when they asked him to smooth his uniform out of a reflex 20 years deep and walked out of the operations center without resistance and without drama, and the door closed behind him, and the room was suddenly very quiet and very empty, in the way that places get when the specific tension that filled them has been removed. The motive came out over the following days in pieces the way these things always do. It was not dramatic. It was almost unbearably ordinary. Doyle had been compromised 8 years earlier in a different country over a debt that should have been small and a decision that should have been simple. And by the time he understood the size of what he had agreed to, the thing had grown teeth. And there were people far away who knew the names of people he loved, and he had spent 8 years telling himself that he passed only small things, harmless things, context and color, and nothing that ever got anyone hurt. He had told himself that right up until the night 6 men ended up pinned in a canyon because the enemy knew exactly where a recon element would be. And then he had warned Whitmore anyway, because by then, warning Whitmore was just the next small thing. And the next small thing was the only kind of thing he knew how to do anymore. When Carver explained it to her, Nora did not feel the satisfaction she had expected. She felt something closer to sadness. Not for Doyle, she had no sympathy left over for a man who had carried a warning that would have ended with her death, and she did not pretend to. But for the shape of it, for how a person becomes that one small, reasonable surrender at a time until they are standing in 4 meters of darkness at 5 in the morning, carrying a message that will kill someone, telling themselves it is the same as all the small things before it. "You broke it open," Carver told her on the last morning as he packed the laptop and the folders into a case that would disappear with him to wherever such cases went. The signals analysis would have gotten there eventually. Maybe. The footprints came back clean by the way your gap had 3 sets of prints in it and one was Doyle's, and that was the corroboration we needed for the warrant. He clicked the case shut. "But you got there first, and you got there with a thing none of my people had. You knew the ground." "I know the ground," she agreed. "It's the same thing that got you through the canyon. It's the only thing I have," she said. "Attention. I'm not braver than anyone. I'm not a better pilot than Holt. I just pay attention to where things are. That's all flying ever was. That's all any of it ever was." Carver looked at her for a moment in the way that people who are about to leave look at people they will not see again. "You're wrong that you're not braver," he said, "but I'll let you keep believing it. It's load-bearing." He picked up the case. "For what it's worth, Captain, the men in that canyon are alive, the network is dead, and a traitor who walked free for 8 years is in a cell. That's a clean board. You don't get a clean board often in this work. A pause. Hold on to it. Then he was gone the way men like him are always gone, and the desert closed over the place where he had been. The 6 men went home over the next 3 weeks one by one as the doctors cleared them. Wilson first, then Chen, then Reyes. Each of them stopping by the flight line before they shipped out because word had traveled the way it always travels among people who have shared a worse night, and every one of them wanted to put a face to the pilot before they left. None of them said very much. There was not very much to say. They shook her hand, or they didn't. Or they just stood near the aircraft for a minute and looked at the small, lean machine that had carried them out of a canyon on 18 inches of clearance and shook their heads at the size of it, and then they went home to whatever waited for them, carrying the rest of their lives in their hands, like something they had been given back. Martinez was the last. He came on his own feet, walking slow but unassisted with Owens beside him, not holding him up, but ready to the way a brother stands ready. He found Nora doing a post-flight on 674, her head inside the engine cowling, and he waited until she came out, and then he stood in front of her in the late afternoon light, with the desert going red and gold behind him. "They're sending me home tomorrow," he said. "I heard. They say I'll fly again, eventually, if I do the work." He said it like a man laying down a bet he intended to win. "I'm going to do the work." "I believe you," she said, and she did. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing he had clearly come to say, and he said it plainly because he was a plain man, and the night had stripped the decoration out of both of them. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 4. She doesn't know any of this happened. She just knows her dad went away and her dad came back." He stopped and his throat worked, and he made himself finish. "She came back because you stood up in a room when nobody else would. She'll never know your name. She'll grow up and have a whole life, and she'll never know that the reason she got to have it is a pilot she never met who flew through a wall of rock in the dark." He looked at her. "I wanted one person to know. So I'm telling you, I know." Nora had flown through a sandstorm and threaded a 6-foot gap and carried 6 men out of a canyon and confronted a colonel and caught a traitor. And she had done all of it with steady hands and a level voice and a nervous system that did not get the message until long after the work was done. This nearly took her down. She held it. Barely. She held it because she was who she was, and because Owens was watching, and because the desert was beautiful behind this man who had decided to live, and because some moments are too large to be met with anything but stillness. "Tell her she's lucky," Nora said finally. "Not because of me, because she has a father who came home and is going to do the work." She paused. "That's the part that matters, not the canyon, the work after." Martinez nodded. He understood. He was a man who understood the work after. Then he did something that the regulations did not require and the situation did not demand, and that no one would ever put in a file. He stepped back and he straightened slow and careful around the healing of his body, and he brought his hand up in a salute. Not the crisp parade ground salute of ceremony, but the slower, deliberate salute of one professional to another across a distance that only the two of them could measure. She returned it. Owens returned it. And the 3 of them stood in the red light for a moment, and then Martinez turned and walked back toward the rest of his life on his own feet, and Owens went with him, and Nora stood by her aircraft and watched them go until the light took them. There is a coda to this, and it is the part Nora would think about for the rest of her career on the long flights in the quiet that comes after the work. It happened 5 weeks later. A different night, a different storm, smaller but bad enough. A different briefing shack, though it smelled the same because they all smelled the same burnt coffee and old fear. A different impossible call. A convoy ambushed in terrain that the medevac birds couldn't reach a window measured in minutes. The same brutal arithmetic that the desert was always running against the people who worked in it. And the same question asked into the same kind of silence. "Any combat pilots here?" Nora was in that room. She was going to stand up. She had already shifted her weight forward, already felt the old familiar settling of a decision arriving before she'd consciously made it. But she didn't get the chance. Because in the second row, before the silence could even finish landing, before it could go long enough to become a decision that no one had to own a chair, scraped back and a man stood up. Captain Darren Holt, 2,000 flight hours, 3 distinguished flying crosses. The man who 5 weeks earlier had raised a coffee cup to his lips and taken a long deliberate sip while a room full of professionals studied the floor. He stood up fast. He stood up first. He stood up the way a man stands up when he has spent 5 weeks unable to stop thinking about the last time he didn't, and he said before anyone could ask him to, before the math could be laid out, before the silence could do its quiet, corrosive work, on a room full of people who knew the answer and didn't like it. I'll go, walk me through it. And he meant it. Nora sat back down. She sat back down because she did not need to stand. Because the room didn't need her this time. Because the thing she had once told a general in an empty operations center, that courage was in more people than anyone knew, that most people simply never got put in the room where the silence ran long enough for them to find out, was it turned out also true of the people who had been in that room and had failed it once, and had carried the failure and had decided somewhere in the 5 weeks since that they would not carry it again. The silence had broken in that first briefing shack, and it had stayed broken. That was the thing no commendation would ever capture, the thing that would not appear in any file or any after-action report or any citation read aloud at any ceremony. 6 men were alive, a network was dead, a traitor was in a cell. Those were the measurable outcomes, the clean board, the facts that could be written down. But the real thing, the thing that actually mattered, was happening right now in front of her in a plywood room at the edge of nowhere. A man who had stayed seated once was on his feet before anyone asked because he had watched someone refuse the silence and had learned the way people only ever really learn anything by seeing it done. Nora watched Holt walk to the map. She listened to him ask the right questions in the right order. His voice steady, his coffee untouched and forgotten on the table behind him. And she understood finally and completely what she had actually done in that first room 5 weeks ago. It was not the canyon, it was not the gap, it was not the 6 men or the traitor or the clean board. It was that she had shown a room full of people that the silence was not inevitable, that it could be broken, that one person standing up changed the weight distribution of everything in a way that propagated outward through every room that person ever sat in, again through every silence they would ever fail to fall into, through every life that would be saved by someone who finally believed that standing up was a thing a person could simply do. She had stood up once, and the standing up had not stayed inside her. It had gotten out. It had moved through the room and through the men who survived and through the man on his feet at the map right now. And it would keep moving through people she would never meet and outcomes she would never measure for as long as any of them lived. That was the mission, not the night in the canyon, not the valley at sunset, not the traitor in the gap, or the handler in custody, or the 4 words spoken without quite deciding to speak them. The mission was that the silence had broken, and it had stayed broken, and it would go on breaking in room after room after room, long after she was gone. She had only ever had to be the first. Everything else was just what happened because of that.